Hello, I'm going to show you how to modify the different service parameters inside of Service Intelligence. Now, what I mean by that is that Service Intelligence has different categories for your vehicles that determine how often services should be due and whether or not they should be flagged for that service. These intervals, like an accessory drive belt performed every 36,000 miles or 36 months, can be controlled by you, as well as whether or not this category tracks your parts or your labor or both, and whether or not it needs to see a certain number of parts or a certain number of labor hours before it gets considered as being performed. This way we can avoid things like top-offs. Now, all of these settings can be modified by going to the location settings and then clicking on the service categories tab here. Once this screen opens up, you'll see that you have a drop-down menu across the top in the second header that has all of the services that we're currently tracking inside of Service Intelligence for you. Now, your list may be different than mine. Every shop has the ability to create custom categories, but you can really tell whether or not a service is on or not by whether or not it's got the blue icon. Now, this does mean that you can have categories built inside of Service Intelligence that are currently not functioning. This is good for placeholders, or perhaps if you've changed from having shocks and struts as a single category, you may have decided to break them out into front and rear shocks separately. Now, the ability to add a new service category is at the top, and then you've got all of your existing listing categories beneath that. So for this case, I'm going to stick with the regular oil change that I've got selected currently. Now, when you open up a service category, you'll have two current sections in the column 2 and in column 3. So column 3 here is showing me examples of items that are currently in my database that are being flagged as included for this service. These items like bulk oil, Chevron oil, and Motorcraft synthetic blend are all being triggered inside of this specific database as services that have qualified to be a regular oil service. And then down here, you'll have my excluded items, which includes items that are specifically being removed, maybe ones that were tracking improperly and needed to be removed, or services that are just not relevant. So when you enter on this table, it does take a second because it does need to pull your database to find this information. But once it populates, it gives you a good idea of whether or not this category is tracking properly. And of course, you've got pagination at the bottom, so you can scroll through and keep looking to see if you've got any mistakes inside of this database. Now, inside of column 2, I've got the ability to change whether or not this category is visible, how it reads to my customers. So instead of engine oil change, we can do regular oil change. Of course, I did not enter space there, so now it says typo, but that's okay. You can change the interval, or how often this service is performed, and how many months before this service is due again, and then whether or not this service is visible on the point of sale reports. Now, sometimes you may want to have a category that you're specifically using for marketing purposes, but something that is not visible at the front counter. So when you're going to hand this report to the customer, it's not visible, but you want to have something that you can send a reminder based upon saying that, hey, this service has not been due yet. It's not often, but this is the option on which you would remove it from those point of sale reports. Additionally, since there's limited space on postcards, it's entirely possible that you have too many categories that inside of Service Intelligence, more than can fit on a postcard. So the show on postcard and the show on reminder emails both allow you to curtail which categories go onto those contacts. Basically, in this case, the default, I think, is that a postcard can have about 12 categories, whereas an email, we only show 8. So pretty much whether or not it's set to true or false will determine whether or not it's going to be one of those 8 or one of those 12. Now, the logo allows you to adjust this little icon in the upper corner. This also takes place in this tab here. You can see these little icons that I've got for these services. Of course, you can modify them, but they are set by default. And then also we have the include part descriptions as well as the display order and display group. Now, these are really specific. I would encourage you to contact the support team if you really have got any questions about these kinds of categories. I'm going to give a brief description of what these mean, but usually in most cases you won't need to change these values away from their default. The display group allows me to flag multiple services as being part of a group. In this database, I've got a regular oil change as well as a synthetic oil change. Now, both of those are oil changes, and I don't want both visible on the report at the same time for my customer. It would make it very confusing if I was telling them that they were due for both a regular and and a synthetic oil change at the same time. So in order to avoid that, we have specified the group LOF and added both of those oil changes to it so that only one of those can be visible to your customers at a time. The display order is primarily used to determine what ranking this service has in conjunction with the others. You can see that the items on this list are actually sorted by their display order. So currently I've got oil changes number 1, synthetic as number 1, tire rotation as number 2, and air filter as number 3. The next ones for part settings and labor settings can be set independently. This determines whether or not Service Intelligence should be tracking things by parts or by labor. So for example, I know that my part descriptions for oil changes are very good and I don't need to track anything using labor. I might just turn off labor entirely. Now you can see that I only have a parts tab at the top and it is only showing me parts that are being flagged for this oil change. Conversely, it might be that I want to track something by labor only, and you'll see that based on the keywords, I have nothing that is currently tracking because my labor keywords were not properly optimized on the system. So in this case, what I'm going to do is turn back the parts. Once it loads all of the excluded items that are not tracking inside of my, my oil changes, I will turn back on the parts, and then I can continue using tracking through this. So all of these have the same settings: the minimum quantity or the minimum hours, the quantity threshold or the hour threshold, and then the minimum charge and the charge threshold. Basically, this is saying that I don't want it to track this oil change if it doesn't meet the minimum quantity. In this case, I'm looking for at least 1 unit. So if I haven't sold a single unit of oil, then it's not going to show up inside of the database. Similarly, there must have been at least $10 spent on this oil change for it to qualify. And because I have labor set to off, it is not tracking. I don't have any minimum hours or minimum charge. And that's it. Thanks for watching.